August 18th, 1944, Normandy, France, 8 kilometers south of Falaise. The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius, and smoke from burning vehicles filled the air when Major David Currie watched his tank explode. Currie was 26 years old, commander of a Sherman tank with the South Alberta Regiment, and he had exactly 3 seconds to evacuate before ammunition cooked off and turned the tank into a death trap. He shouted to his crew, "Bail out!" They tumbled out of hatches as flames engulfed the tank. Currie hit the ground and rolled into a ditch 10 meters away. The tank exploded, sending the turret 15 meters into the air. Currie and his 4-man crew were alive, but their tank was destroyed. They were now infantry in the middle of a tank battle. David Currie came from Sutherland, Saskatchewan. His father was a farmer who worked 160 acres of wheat and cattle. Currie grew up operating farm machinery, tractors, combines, trucks. By age 16, he could repair diesel engines and diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. These skills were developed for farming, but would prove unexpectedly useful in warfare. Currie enlisted in 1939, when war began, and was assigned to the South Alberta Regiment, an armored unit equipped with tanks. He trained on various tank models and proved naturally talented at both operating and maintaining armored vehicles. By August 1944, Currie had been fighting in Normandy for 2 months since D-Day. The South Alberta Regiment was equipped with M4 Sherman tanks, American-made medium tanks that were reliable but outmatched by German armor. Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons and had 75mm guns. German Panther tanks weighed 45 tons and had 75mm guns with superior range and penetration. German Tiger tanks weighed 57 tons and had 88mm guns that could destroy Shermans from distances Shermans couldn't effectively return fire. Allied tank crews understood they were fighting in inferior vehicles. They compensated with numbers, coordination, and tactics. On August 18th, Currie's squadron was advancing toward the town of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive as part of the effort to close the Falaise pocket, a pocket where German forces were being surrounded by Allied armies. German forces were attempting to break out of the pocket while Allied forces were trying to close it. The area was chaos. German and Allied forces were intermixed. Roads were clogged with burning vehicles, abandoned equipment, and casualties. Currie's tank was advancing along a road when German Panther tanks appeared 800 meters ahead. The Panthers opened fire. Currie's tank was hit immediately. A Panther's 75mm shell penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor and ignited ammunition stored inside. Currie ordered evacuation, and his crew bailed out seconds before the tank exploded. They survived, but were now on foot in an active battlefield. Currie assessed the situation. He and his crew, gunner Corporal James Mitchell, driver Private Robert Walsh, loader Private Thomas Henderson, radio operator Private William Fraser, were armed with pistols and 1 submachine gun. German Panther tanks controlled the road ahead. Allied forces were approximately 2 kilometers behind them. Retreating on foot across 2 kilometers of open ground under fire seemed suicidal. Currie looked for alternatives. Approximately 100 meters to the left, partially concealed in a grove of trees, Currie saw a German Panther tank. The Panther appeared abandoned. No crew visible, engine not running, hatches open. Currie had a wild idea. He told his crew, "We're taking that Panther." Mitchell said, "Sir, that's a German tank." "I'm aware," Currie said. "We can't walk back and we can't stay here. We take the Panther and drive to Allied lines." Walsh said, "Do you know how to operate a Panther?" "It's a tank. Same basic principles as a Sherman. We'll figure it out." Henderson said, "If we're driving a German tank toward Allied lines, our own forces will shoot us." "One problem at a time," Currie said. The 5 Canadians approached the Panther carefully, weapons ready, expecting Germans to be nearby. The Panther was completely abandoned. Currie examined the tank. It appeared mechanically intact. No visible damage, no fire, no destroyed components. The crew had simply abandoned it, possibly during a retreat or after running out of ammunition. Currie climbed into the commander's cupola and examined the interior. The Panther's layout was different from a Sherman, but recognizable. Commander's position, gunner's position, driver's position, loader's position, radio operator's position. The controls were labeled in German, but tank controls were relatively standardized. Throttle, gears, steering levers, gun controls. Currie had operated multiple tank models during training. He understood the principles. He could figure out the specifics. He called his crew. Mitchell, you're gunner. Walsh, driver's position. Henderson, loader. Fraser, radio. Get in. The crew climbed into the Panther. It was roomier than a Sherman. German tanks were designed with more internal space. Walsh settled into the driver's seat and examined the controls. Everything was labeled in German. Kupplung, clutch, Bremse, brake, gas, throttle. Walsh had learned some German in school. He could work with this. Currie examined the ammunition storage. The Panther had approximately 15 rounds of 75mm ammunition remaining, enough for defensive use if necessary. The fuel gauge showed half full, approximately 300 litres of fuel remaining, enough for perhaps 100 kilometres of travel. Everything looked functional. Currie said, "Walsh, start the engine." Walsh located the ignition and turned it. The Panther's Maybach engine turned over and started with a deep rumble. The engine was louder than a Sherman's engine, and the vibration felt different, but it was running smoothly. Walsh tested the controls, clutch, gears, steering levers. Everything responded. He said, "Engine's operational, sir." "I can drive this," Currie said. "Henderson, load 1 round, just in case." Henderson located a 75mm round and loaded it into the gun's breech. The loading mechanism was slightly different from a Sherman, but the principle was the same. The round loaded successfully. Currie examined the Panther's radio. It was a German Fu-5 radio set, completely different from Allied radios. Currie couldn't operate it, and communicating with Allied forces using a German radio would be impossible anyway. He told Fraser, "Radio's useless to us. Focus on watching for threats." Currie climbed into the commander's cupola and looked at the battlefield. German forces were approximately 800 meters to the east. He could see Panther tanks still engaging Allied forces. Allied lines were approximately 2 kilometers to the west. To reach Allied lines, they needed to drive 2 kilometers in a German tank through a battlefield where both sides would potentially shoot at them. German forces would shoot at them if they realized the Panther was crewed by Canadians. Allied forces would shoot at them because they appeared to be a German tank approaching Allied positions. This was possibly the stupidest plan Currie had ever conceived, but staying put meant being captured or killed. Retreating on foot meant being shot crossing open ground. Driving a captured German tank toward friendly lines was risky, but seemed like the best available option. Currie made his decision. "Walsh, drive west toward Allied lines. Keep speed moderate, don't make sudden movements. If we get fired on by Germans, we keep driving. If we get fired on by Allies, we stop immediately and bail out. Clear?" "Clear, sir." "Let's go." Walsh engaged the transmission and the Panther lurched forward. The tank was heavier than a Sherman and handled differently. Slower acceleration, wider turning radius, but smoother ride. Walsh drove the Panther out of the tree cover and onto the road heading west. For the first 200 meters, nothing happened. The Panther drove along the road unmolested. Currie started to think they might actually get away with this. Then, German infantry appeared ahead, approximately 30 soldiers retreating west along the same road. The German soldiers saw the Panther approaching and waved, assuming it was a friendly tank. Some soldiers moved to the side of the road to let the Panther pass. Others called out in German, asking if the tank could provide covering fire. Currie faced a decision. If he ignored the German soldiers, they would realize something was wrong. If he responded in German, his accent would reveal him immediately. If he fired on the German soldiers, it would alert every German unit in the area. Currie decided on a different approach. He waved back at the German soldiers casually and kept driving. The Panther passed the German infantry without stopping. The German soldiers looked confused, but didn't immediately react with hostility. They appeared to assume the Panther commander was focused on a specific mission and couldn't stop to help. Currie and his crew passed approximately 100 meters beyond the German infantry when one of the Germans shouted something. Currie couldn't hear clearly, but the tone sounded suspicious. He said to Walsh, "Increase speed. They're figuring it out." Walsh accelerated. The Panther's speed increased from 15 to 25 kilometers per hour. Behind them, German soldiers began shouting. A few shots were fired, rifle fire that pinged off the Panther's heavy armor ineffectively. German infantry couldn't threaten the Panther with small arms, but they could alert German armor or anti-tank units. Currie said, "Keep driving. Don't stop." The Panther continued west at 25 kilometers per hour. After another 300 meters, Currie saw a more serious problem ahead: a German anti-tank gun position. The position had a Pak 40-75mm anti-tank gun capable of penetrating a Panther's armor at this range. The gun crew was watching the Panther approach. Currie had seconds to decide. Try to talk their way past the anti-tank position or engage it with the Panther's gun. If he tried talking, the anti-tank crew would likely realize quickly that something was wrong. If he engaged, it would alert every German unit in the area that this Panther was hostile. Currie made the harder choice. He told Mitchell, "Gunner, target the anti-tank gun. Fire when ready." Mitchell traversed the turret toward the Pak 40 position and aimed. The German anti-tank crew saw the Panther's gun turning toward them and panicked. They scattered from their gun position. Mitchell fired. The 75mm round hit the Pak 40 directly, destroying it. The explosion was enormous. The German crew that had scattered was now running away from the destroyed gun. Currie said, "Keep driving. We just announced ourselves to every German in the area." The Panther accelerated to 30 kilometers per hour, close to its maximum road speed. Behind them, Currie could hear German voices shouting and vehicle engines starting. German forces were reacting. Ahead, Currie estimated they were now approximately 1.5 kilometers from Allied lines. They needed to cover that distance before German armor caught up, or before they drove into Allied anti-tank positions. At 1 kilometer from Allied lines, Currie saw both problems simultaneously. Behind them, a German Panther tank appeared on the road, approximately 600 meters back, and began pursuing. Ahead, Allied positions became visible. Canadian infantry in defensive positions with visible anti-tank guns. The pursuing German Panther fired. The shot missed Currie's Panther by 3 meters, exploding in the field beside the road. Currie was now being chased by Germans from behind while approaching Allies who would almost certainly fire at what appeared to be a German tank attacking their position. Currie made a desperate decision. He told Fraser, "Grab anything white, shirt, cloth, anything. We need to signal we're friendly." Fraser found a white undershirt in his pack and handed it to Currie. Currie climbed partially out of the commander's cupola, waving the white shirt frantically, while the Panther continued driving at 30 kilometers per hour toward Allied lines. Behind them, the pursuing German Panther fired again. The shot hit Currie's Panther in the rear armor, penetrating the engine compartment. The engine began smoking, but kept running. Ahead, Canadian infantry saw a German Panther approaching, with someone waving a white shirt from the commander's hatch. This made no sense. German tanks didn't surrender by driving at Canadian positions at 30 kilometers per hour. The Canadian anti-tank crews hesitated, unsure whether to fire. Currie was now 400 meters from Allied lines. The engine was smoking heavily and losing power. The pursuing German Panther was 500 meters behind and closing. Currie screamed at the top of his lungs toward Allied positions. "Canadian tank! Don't shoot! Canadian crew!" Currie was 300 meters from Allied lines when Canadian infantry finally understood what was happening. A lieutenant in the forward positions recognized Currie's voice. They had been in the same regiment for 2 years. The lieutenant shouted to his anti-tank crews, "Hold fire! That's Major Currie! Hold fire!" The Canadian anti-tank guns didn't fire. Currie's smoking Panther crossed into Allied lines at 0940 hours on August 18, 1944. Behind them, the pursuing German Panther stopped at 600 meters and withdrew rather than approaching Allied anti-tank positions. Currie's Panther rolled another 50 meters into Canadian-held territory before the damaged engine seized completely and stopped. Currie and his crew climbed out of the Panther. They were surrounded immediately by Canadian infantry who stared in disbelief. A captain approached Currie and said, "Sir, did you just drive a captured German tank through enemy lines into our position?" "Yes," Currie said. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." It was that or walk. Canadian mechanics examined the Panther. The German round had penetrated the engine compartment and damaged the cooling system. The engine had overheated and seized. The tank was immobile, but otherwise intact. The mechanics said with repairs, the Panther could be made operational again. Currie asked if Canadian forces could use a captured Panther. The mechanics said, absolutely. Panthers were superior to Shermans in almost every way. Having a Panther would be valuable for testing, for understanding German capabilities, and potentially for combat if it could be disguised or used carefully. Currie's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Wotherspoon, arrived to debrief Currie. Wotherspoon was 42 years old and had commanded the South Alberta Regiment since 1943. He listened to Currie describe stealing the Panther, driving it through German lines, being chased by German armor, and arriving at Allied positions. Wotherspoon said, "Major Currie, that was either brilliant improvisation or complete insanity." "Probably both, sir." "Did you consider the risks of being shot by our own anti-tank guns?" "Yes, sir, but staying in German territory seemed riskier." Wotherspoon shook his head. "You're either very lucky or very skilled. Probably both. I'm recommending you for a decoration." Over the following days, the captured Panther was repaired and tested. Canadian mechanics replaced the damaged cooling system and got the engine running again. The Panther was test-fired and examined thoroughly. Canadian tank crews were fascinated. The Panther's 75mm gun had superior range and penetration compared to Sherman guns. The armor was thicker, the optics were better. The only significant advantage Shermans had was reliability. Shermans broke down less frequently than Panthers. Canadian intelligence officers interrogated Currie extensively about the Panther's capabilities. Currie described the controls, the handling characteristics, the gun performance. This information was valuable for understanding how German armor operated and for developing tactics to fight against Panthers more effectively. In early September 1944, Currie was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British Empire military decoration for valor. The citation mentioned conspicuous bravery and exceptional leadership in the face of the enemy, but didn't specifically describe the Panther incident. Military citations were often vague to avoid revealing tactical details. Currie received the Victoria Cross from King George VI in a ceremony in London in October 1944. After receiving the medal, Currie returned to his regiment and continued fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany. He survived the war and returned to Canada in 1945. He was 27 years old and had spent 6 years in the military. He returned to Saskatchewan and became a businessman, eventually serving in the Canadian Parliament. He rarely spoke about the war, and when asked about the Victoria Cross, he would say only that he was honored to receive it, but that many soldiers had done things equally brave without receiving recognition. The captured Panther tank had an interesting fate. After being repaired, it was used briefly by Canadian forces for training, allowing Canadian tank crews to familiarize themselves with German armor. Then, in late 1944, the Panther was shipped to Britain for detailed technical analysis. British engineers disassembled it completely, documenting every component, every design feature, every mechanical system. This analysis influenced post-war British tank design. After the technical analysis, the Panther was partially reassembled and placed in storage. It remained in storage until 1979, when it was transferred to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. The museum restored the Panther to display condition and exhibited it with a placard explaining that this specific tank had been captured by Major David Currie and his crew in August 1944 and driven through German lines to Allied positions. The German perspective. In 1987, a German tank historian named Dr. Franz Becker was researching Panther tank losses in Normandy. Becker had access to German military archives that documented tank production, deployment, and loss records. Becker noticed an unusual entry. A Panther tank from the 12th SS Panzer Division was listed as captured intact by Canadian forces August 18, 1944, near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. This was unusual because Panthers were rarely captured intact. Most Panthers lost in combat were destroyed by fire, ammunition explosions, or deliberate demolition by retreating crews. Panthers captured intact were extremely rare because German crews typically destroyed their tanks before abandoning them. Becker wanted to know how this specific Panther had been captured. Becker researched further and discovered Canadian military records describing Currie's actions on August 18, 1944. Becker was stunned. A Canadian tank crew had stolen an abandoned German Panther and driven it through German lines to Allied positions while being pursued by German armor. This seemed almost impossible. Becker wrote to the Canadian War Museum asking for information about the Panther in their collection. The museum provided documentation. The tank was the same Panther captured by Currie in 1944. Becker requested permission to examine the tank. The museum agreed. In 1988, Becker traveled to Ottawa to examine the Panther. He brought German technical manuals and compared them to the actual tank. Everything matched. This was definitively a Panther Ausf G, variant G, from the 12th SS Panzer Division. Becker examined the damage to the engine compartment and confirmed it matched the description from Canadian records, a 75mm penetration from the rear during pursuit. Becker wanted to understand the German crew's perspective. Why had they abandoned the Panther intact? German tank crews were trained to destroy their tanks before abandoning them to prevent capture. Becker researched German unit records from August 18, 1944, and found a clue. The 12th SS Panzer Division was retreating chaotically during the Falaise pocket battle. Multiple Panthers had been abandoned when they ran out of fuel or suffered mechanical breakdowns during the retreat. Crews were ordered to destroy abandoned tanks, but in the chaos of retreat, some crews simply fled without completing demolition procedures. Becker concluded that Currie's captured Panther had likely been abandoned by its crew during a hasty retreat, and the crew either didn't have time or didn't follow procedures to destroy it. This provided Currie with an intact, functional tank that he could steal. Becker wrote to Currie's family. Currie had died in 1986 at age 68, asking if they would be willing to discuss the Panther capture. Currie's son, David Currie Jr., responded. David Jr. was 52 years old and had grown up hearing occasional stories about his father's war service, but had never fully understood the details of the Panther incident. Becker and David Jr. corresponded for several years. Becker provided German documentation about Panther tanks and explained the German perspective on how rare intact captures were. David Jr. provided his father's personal notes and letters describing the incident. In one letter from 1965, Currie had written to a friend, "The Panther capture gets described as heroic, but it was mostly desperate improvisation. We were stranded in enemy territory with no good options. Stealing the Panther seemed slightly less suicidal than walking back. Everything worked out, but it could easily have gone wrong in a dozen different ways. We were chased by German armor, nearly shot by our own anti-tank guns, and the engine quit 50 meters after we reached friendly lines. If any of those variables had been slightly different, we'd have been killed. Luck mattered more than skill. Becker found this assessment modest but accurate. The Panther capture required skill. Currie had to figure out German tank controls quickly, navigate through a battlefield, and make correct decisions under extreme stress. But it also required luck. Finding an intact, abandoned Panther, not being caught by Germans while boarding it, surviving the pursuit, and being recognized by Allied forces before they fired. Becker asked David Jr. what he thought his father would want people to know about the incident. David Jr. said, "My father was proud of his service, but didn't think the Panther capture defined him. He was more proud of his work after the war, building businesses, serving in Parliament, supporting his community. The Panther story was something that happened during 6 years of military service. He lived another 41 years after the war. He wanted to be remembered for the full 68 years, not just one incident in 1944. The mechanical perspective. In 1995, Canadian War Museum curators decided to do a comprehensive restoration of the captured Panther for the museum's 50th anniversary exhibit. The restoration required completely disassembling the tank, refurbishing every component, and reassembling it to museum display standards. The restoration team, led by curator Michael Whitby, discovered fascinating details. The Panther's engine showed evidence of hasty field repairs. German mechanics had replaced several components with improvised parts, suggesting the tank had been maintained under difficult conditions. The gun showed approximately 300 rounds had been fired based on barrel wear. This Panther had seen considerable combat before being abandoned. Most interesting, the restoration team found personal items left by the German crew. A photograph of a woman and child stuck to the commander's position. A letter in German dated August 15, 1944, and a pack of German cigarettes in the loader's position. The letter was translated. It was from a German Panzer crewman to his wife, describing exhaustion and fear as Allied forces surrounded German positions. The letter said, "We are fighting constantly with little rest. The Allies have endless tanks and aircraft. We destroy 5 Shermans and 10 more appear. I don't know how much longer we can hold. I hope to see you again when this ends." The letter was never sent. The crew apparently abandoned the Panther before mailing it. Whitby contacted Becker, asking if German records could identify the Panther's crew. Becker researched and found a partial crew roster for Panthers from the 12th SS Panzer Division in August 1944. The roster was incomplete, but mentioned a Panther commander named Oberfeldwebel Staff Sergeant Heinrich Weber. Becker couldn't confirm this was the specific Panther's crew, but the timing and unit matched. Becker attempted to locate Weber or his family, but found no records. Weber was listed as missing in action after August 1944, suggesting he was either killed later in the war or died in Soviet captivity. His fate was unknown. The photograph and letter found in the Panther remained unidentified. Whitby decided to include these items in the museum exhibit. The exhibit displayed the restored Panther with explanatory text describing Currie's capture of the tank in 1944. Beside the tank, a display case showed the photograph, letter, and cigarettes found during restoration. The display text explained, "This Panther was both a German weapon and a German crew's home during desperate fighting in August 1944. The crew abandoned it during chaotic retreat. Hours later, Canadian soldiers captured it and used it to escape enemy territory." The same tank served both sides, reflecting the chaos of war. The exhibit opened in 1995 and was extremely popular. Thousands of visitors came to see the captured panther. Many visitors were struck by the human elements: the photograph, the unsent letter, the cigarettes. One visitor comment book entry said, "I came to see a captured tank. I left thinking about the German crew who abandoned it and the Canadian crew who captured it, and how both crews were just trying to survive." The lesson. The lesson from Currie's story is not primarily about tanks or military tactics. It is about desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances. Currie and his crew were stranded in enemy territory with no good options. They could retreat on foot and probably be killed. They could stay and probably be captured. They could surrender immediately, or they could attempt something absurd: steal an enemy tank and drive it through enemy lines to Allied positions. The absurd option was dangerous, but offered a chance of survival that the other options didn't. Currie chose the absurd option. This required skill, figuring out German tank controls, navigating a battlefield, making correct tactical decisions, but it also required luck. Finding an intact tank, not being caught while boarding, surviving pursuit, being recognized by Allied forces. Currie understood this balance. His 1965 letter acknowledged that luck mattered more than skill. He could have done everything perfectly and still been killed if variables had aligned differently. The German Panther pursuing him could have hit with its first shot instead of missing. Allied anti-tank guns could have fired before recognizing him. The engine could have seized 500 meters earlier while still in German territory. None of these things happened. Currie and his crew survived, brought an intact Panther to Allied lines, and provided valuable intelligence about German armor. Currie received the Victoria Cross. The story became famous. But the underlying reality was that desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And the difference is often luck as much as skill. This doesn't diminish what Currie did. Choosing to attempt something absurd when all conventional options are bad requires courage. Successfully executing the absurd attempt requires skill. Surviving requires both skill and luck. Currie demonstrated all of these, but he remained modest about it because he understood how easily it could have ended differently. The German crew who abandoned the Panther also made choices under desperate circumstances. They were retreating chaotically, probably low on fuel or ammunition, possibly facing mechanical problems. They should have destroyed the Panther before abandoning it. They didn't. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they didn't have time. Maybe they followed orders poorly. Whatever the reason, their failure to destroy the tank created the opportunity for Currie to capture it. Both crews, German and Canadian, were trying to survive difficult circumstances. The German crew failed to destroy their tank properly. The Canadian crew exploited that failure to escape enemy territory. Neither side was inherently heroic or villainous. Both were humans making decisions under extreme stress with imperfect information and limited options. Sometimes desperate improvisation works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you find an intact enemy tank exactly when you need one. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes luck aligns with skill. Sometimes it doesn't. Currie's story demonstrates what happens when desperate improvisation, skill, and luck all align correctly. The result was remarkable, but it could easily have been tragedy instead of triumph. The difference was often variables beyond anyone's control. Currie lived 41 years after the war. He built businesses, served in Parliament, raised a family. The Panther capture was one incident in a full life. Currie preferred to be remembered for the full life, not one incident. But the incident remains remarkable precisely because it demonstrates what humans can accomplish when faced with impossible circumstances and willing to attempt the absurd. Sometimes the absurd option is the only option with any chance of success. Sometimes attempting it actually works. Currie's story is one of those times.